Okay, welcome to this sort of general review for the midterm exam. Hopefully it will be helpful. It does not substitute for having read the textbook, knowing the terms that are in the textbook, having looked at the graphics, the maps, thought about interpreting them. It doesn't substitute for any of that, but it might help you as you study to focus a little bit and make sure you're getting key ideas. On the Regents exam or the midterm, largely it's going to be about applying the understanding you have rather than simply spitting back memorized facts. So let's begin at the very beginning. Whenever you study history, the first thing you always have to take into account is geography. Geography, we know, is the driver of culture. It drives culture and it drives economics. Why? Because geography includes climate, soil, terrain, that is mountains, harbors, seashores, all of that, which therefore affects food. Food sources themselves affect things like migration. People are going to stay in places that have good and abundant food sources, and as climate changes, which it always does over time, they're going to follow those food sources. If their major food source is something like animals, they're following herds of buffalo, they're going to, to migrate after them. If they do some farming, as climate changes, the weather changes, soil gets depleted over time, and so they're going to look for a better climate or better soil. All of that affects things like settlement patterns. Hunters, tribes that essentially are following animals for food, are going to be nomadic because the animals move. They're going to follow herds. Farmers, on the other hand, are going to tend to settle in places for longer periods of time. And many cultures, of course, will be a combination of the two. Geography also affects social status. Well, it may not be obvious at first, right? But in a society, who is the top class in that society? Who are the people calling the shots? Who have the power? If the primary food and clothing source is animals, then your hunters, which is mostly going to be the males traditionally, will be the top layer. It will be the best hunters in the tribe, or the men who are best suited to organizing hunts, who will be your chiefs and who will be making law for the tribe. If the primary food source is cultivated crops, farmers will be your top class. They're the ones who are providing food to the tribe. And so higher status for women. Women are left behind while the men hunt. So in a society where you are growing three sisters farming, right? Beans, corn, and squash, and we can put that in there. Beans, corn, and squash. You're going to wind up with somebody needing to tend those as they grow. They need to be watered, they need to be weeded, and so on. Well, who can settle with those? The women who also have the children that they're burdened with, right? So the moms have to look after the little kids. The kids stay in one place. The moms stay in one place. They look after the farms. And the men can occasionally go out and hunt. Who's going to have a lot of power in that society? Women are going to have power. They may not be solely in charge, but certainly women are going to be taken more seriously. Climate and geography are also going to affect things like religion. What is the center of your religion? Is it animal gods, hunting gods, or is it farming gods, rain gods? So we see that geography affects food sources, movement, settlement or migration, even religion. The original population in the Americas, you should know, came across on the land bridge in the last ice age. And we can take a look at that for a sec. So up in Alaska and the end of Russia, the last time you had a major ice age, um, the ocean water got all sort of sucked up into the ice caps. So around the North Pole and the South Pole, those polar ice caps expanded. As they expanded, they drew more water into them. That lowered the sea level. And as the sea level lowered, you had land kind of show up, therefore, in these shallower areas, and you were able to walk from what is today northeast Russia into Alaska. Well, that's great. Where else does that get you, though? So if you look over here, nope. No. Hang on. Sorry, this is what I was looking for. So we look at this. So that's up where we were talking about over here, yeah, across to Alaska. So you have this land bridge, which was partially land because the Arctic Ocean was becoming a big glacier, and partially probably ice, glacier as well. We think that some folks traveled across here into Alaska and then down into North America. We think others perhaps were able to move along the coast. So as that coast expanded here, people could take small boats, canoe kind of boats, through here and around and follow the coast down into what is now North America. And so you wind up then with the Native Americans coming down into what's now Canada, North America, and South America, and settling. If we look at this map here, this is a DNA map. So scientists, now that we can do DNA science, can parse out genes, genetics, and look at relationships between populations. As we discussed in class, scientists can now prove that all human beings currently alive on planet Earth go back to the same DNA pool over here in East Africa. And if you look at this, we are looking at more than 100,000 years ago. So down here, you've got folks, and you don't have to read this whole map, but we're talking about maybe 200,000 years ago, you had people living here. Over time, they migrated, at least groups of them, I should say, migrated to other places, up into the Middle East, over into Asia, and then eventually from Asia down into the Americas. We assumed that this was the case for decades. Based on the archaeology, we could look at what the land formation up here, this is Russia and Alaska, was based upon cultural relationships we saw between the Native American tribes. But now that we can do the science, we can show that, again, if you look at the DNA, between about 50 and maybe 25,000 years ago, you had different groups come over. That land bridge, we think, existed 50, 40, 30, 20,000 years ago. It was not something that was there for a day. It was something that was there for some thousands of years. We also think that those migrations took place several times. So several different groups came down from Asia in different times. And so you can see here you've got probably 4 or 5 different migrations. Now, they settle in this new land, the Americas, and in North America, they settled in different spots here. And these different colors are, of course, the different cultural areas as we refer to them. These are the different names of various tribes. These are mostly the Native American names for their own tribes, or at least us trying to approximate the sound of them, the Kiowa and the Osage and the Wichita. Many of our places are named for them. So Illinois, Ute Indians, Utah, Chickasaw. There's Chickasaw Mountain down in Georgia. The Cherokee are down here. The Cherokee eventually wind up migrating into this area. The Susquehannock, you may know the Susquehanna River in Pennsylvania, and so on. Upstate New York, you had a group of tribes that we refer to as the Iroquois. That included the Mohawk, the Oneida, the Onondaga, the Cayuga, and the Seneca. And if you've ever traveled through upstate New York, you know there's a Mohawk River, there's a town called Oneida, and these are all names of lakes and counties up there, Lake Cayuga. Now, this light green here, right, this is the Eastern Woodland Indians. Eastern Woodlands, what are they going to have up here? They're going to have long winters, but they're going to have summers, so they can grow crops like Three Sisters farming. Many of them are along the coastal areas. They did some fishing. They certainly had forests up here, and so they used wood for many things, including their housing. We looked at class at those long houses, those kind of cabin sort of lodges that they made from wood and bark. And so it's going to affect their lifestyle. They gave prominent place to women in their tribes because they were a farming-based community. And so the women stayed home, looked after the farms and the kids, while the men went out hunting for meat. That made them somewhat different from, say, down here. You've got this area. This is today Arizona and New Mexico. Very desert atmosphere, you know. So the Navajo people, the Zuni people, the Hopi people, the Pueblo people, they live down here. Not a lot of forest. And so they are building their homes from adobe. We remember that sort of mud cement, really, that they made their homes from. In the center area here, this is the Great Plains. So you've got Nebraska, South Dakota, North Dakota, Kansas, big, wide open grasslands full of animals, largely the buffalo. And so these are primarily hunting people, and they tended to be male-based and nomadic. So the famous teepee is what they're living in. The teepees are really just tents and easily collapsible. You could fold up real teepees. You could fold up almost like an umbrella and move it wherever you needed it as you followed a herd of animals. Okay. One of the groups of these Native Americans that we might talk about a little bit are the Iroquois. We talked before about the Iroquois being a group of tribes located in upstate New York. Nope, I don't need that one. There we go. So the Iroquois Confederacy is an interesting group to notice. Native Americans were not dumb, and they were not unsophisticated. They looked rather different from Europeans in how they structured their societies, but there are a lot of similarities. So in upstate New York, you had these tribes that moved about in these areas. The Mohawk people, the Oneida people, the Onondaga, the Cayuga, that's Lake Cayuga there, and there's a Lake Seneca over here, and the Seneca peoples. They spoke the same language. They spoke the Iroquoian language. And even though they were independent tribes, they got together and made a league, an alliance, if you like, between them. The originally 5 tribes, and then later they added a 6th, the Tuscaroras, became the tribes of the Confederacy. All the tribes agreed to be governed by the decisions of a sort of central council. So each tribe governed itself, but they came together and made peace treaties among them, traded among them, and the rules for that peace and the rules for those trades they made as a group. It's a kind of representative democracy. I'll just also point out to you that this is the original wampum, which was really just a sort of beaded belt that was used to commemorate this. So the way the Native Americans, who didn't have a written language, recorded things was through art, really. And one of their great arts was making these woven belts out of these little beads that were made from shells, from shellfish, the purple and the white. And so the original had five tribes in it, 1, 2, 3, 4, and then the central figure here, 5. And this is a way of recording that peace treaty. Traditionally, this represented the Seneca on the western side, the Mohawk on the eastern side, the Onondaga Nation, which was central and was sort of the, if you want, a capital city of this confederation, and then the Cayuga and the Oneida. So we only mention this because it shows that this idea of representative democracy, in a very different form from what you find in Europe, was already there among Native Americans. So it's wrong to consider them sort of primitive or uncultured. They were different from Europeans, though. Okay. These geographical considerations are also going to affect the colonies. When Europeans begin to colonize the area, they also are going to be affected by differences in geography. The colonies in the New England area, the purple up here, that includes Massachusetts, Rhode Island, Connecticut, New Hampshire. Maine, today, this state, was considered part of Massachusetts. It was kind of an extension of Massachusetts up here. Those are the New England colonies. New England colonies, you're up north. Long winters, short summers, rocky soil, lots of woodsy forest. So you're not going to get, you're going to get local farming. You're going to get small farms that people can grow enough food for their family, but you're not going to make a lot of money on a farm like that. The money up in New England came from the fishing. Off here is good, cold North Atlantic water, which is the best for fishing. And so they fished the cod, we remember that codfish, which they could dry out, salt, preserve it, and ship it back to England, and that was their cash crop, if you like. Because it is short growing seasons and small farms, the farms are clustered into villages, and the villages have their own little church. They have a little school because everybody cooperates to create that. And so that's going to, those schools really grow out of the geography of the place. Almost everybody in New England is going to be a Puritan. So they're English speaking, and Puritan Protestant religion. On the other hand, down here, the orange, you have the southern colonies. Maryland, Virginia, North Carolina, South Carolina, Georgia. Warmer down here. Nice long summers, rich soil, lots of opportunity to grow. So in the southern colonies, they did have farming as a business. Originally, primarily tobacco. Huge tobacco farms. The more land you could get, the larger your farm was. You grew more tobacco, you shipped it over to England and made a ton of money. That gave an incentive to get more land and more land and more land. And pretty soon, the whole South is dominated by just a few enormous landowners a lot of smaller farmers who are very poor, and of course, to run those big tobacco plantations, you need slaves. There was slavery in all of the colonies, we remember, but in New England, you didn't really need too many slaves to run your farm, so there weren't that many. In the South, the tobacco plantations needed huge numbers of slaves, and so you had lots of slavery. Half the population of some of these southern colonies were slaves. In the South, just about everybody is an Anglican Protestant Christian. They speak English, and so that too, like New England, is very homogeneous. People are pretty much the same. The middle colonies are New York, Pennsylvania, New Jersey, and Delaware. These are pretty good for growing, but not for tobacco. Much better for growing things like grain. And so they grew wheat, they grew corn, they grew barley and oats and rye. But it was also a good place for lumber and wood. It was also a good place for fishing. When you think of the middle colonies, you think of diversity, the largest or the biggest range of things that were produced. They were also settled by the greatest range of people. Middle colonies were settled by English folks, both Anglicans and Puritans, was settled by Quakers, who had their own very different take on religion. There were Dutch people here. There were Swedish people here. There were German people here. You had Lutheran Protestants. You even had a handful of Catholics in some of these places. So when you think about the middle colonies here, you're thinking diversity. Where did you get the greatest toleration, therefore? In the middle colonies. They couldn't afford to be intolerant. In New England, everybody was a Puritan, and if you showed up in New England and you weren't Puritan, you either became Puritan or they threatened to kick you out. In the southern colonies, everybody was Anglican, and pretty much everybody was already Anglican, and they didn't really like people who weren't. In the middle colonies, because it was settled by all different groups, New York was settled by the Dutch, parts of New Jersey by the Dutch, Pennsylvania by English Quakers, but also by a lot of German Lutherans. They couldn't afford to be intolerant. They needed those different settlers. And so the general attitude in the middle colonies was, you know what, leave them alone. As long as they're not bothering anybody and they go with the program. In New York, for instance, even though New York was originally settled by the Dutch and the Dutch reformed, the general attitude was, as long as they're not causing a problem, as long as they're not giving anybody trouble, leave them alone and let them do their thing. So, New England, think Puritan, English, and think about things like fishing and some lumber. Small farms, short growing season, rocky soil. Southern colonies, think about large plantations, lots of slavery, cash crops. And again, everybody Anglican down there. Middle colonies, think greatest diversity of economic activity and products, greatest diversity of religion, of language, of kinds of people, and therefore, whether they liked it or not, they had to be the most tolerant. Okay, we'll leave this segment there and pick up with the next segment in the next video.